Hi, welcome back to Spring CS170. Let's continue on with the JavaScript variables. So you remember back here, we were talking about variables with meaningful names. So how do we actually declare a variable? Declare a variable means just to tell the computer that here's a bucket, here's the name of that bucket. Right, well, in this case, we're using looks like little Tupperware boxes or something like that. Uh, but I look at them as buckets, right? And you can put something in them, right? So in this case, you have var, which declares a variable, var, okay? And then they visualize it with this little Tupperware thing, right? So here's an age, and what's the value that we put in there? Maybe I declare your age to be 20 or something like that. So that's the value that would go into this bucket, okay? Now the other thing you can do is on one line, you can declare multiple variables. Okay, so instead of saying something like this, var age, var area, var radius, you can do something like this. This kind of saves you a little bit, right, of effort. So you say var, then you declare variable for area and variable for radius, and you get these two buckets here. Okay, and notice no values have been assigned, right? You see nothing here that says what these values are. You just declared the bucket, right? You created this bucket, right? Um, so this is a convention. You don't have to do this. Uh, so people may declare their variable and then decide later on, say, well, yeah, however farther down the code, I'll actually set it to something, right? Maybe I'll set the age to be 21 or whatever, right? But I think it's good that in a language that doesn't like initialize these variables, I think it's good for you to initialize these variables. So I might declare the variable and initialize to be 0, right, at the beginning. So there's no like question about what's in this bucket or not in this bucket, right? So I would say age equals to 0, area equals to 0, radius equals to 0, right at the very beginning when I initialize, not when I initialize, when I declare the variable, right? That's why it's called declaration, right? And remember the JSDO, you can see the example right here, right? So here's var, and then here's the variable, and look, they do initialization, right? So they initialize it, in this case, they initialize it to be hello, okay? So that's what I mean by saying declaration and then initialization, right? Declaration is this side over here, and then initialization is this over here, right? And you can do it further down. You can do something like var variable, and then you put the semicolon here, right? And then, down here you can say the variable 1 equals to hello, okay? However you want to do it, but this is, to me, this is nice and tidy, right? So in one shot, you do the declaration and the initialization in one shot. You don't have to do it that way, but that's my recommendation, okay? So make note of that, okay? So these are what they call the data types, right? So what can you imagine data types would be? Probably the first two will probably come to your head. Well, maybe it comes to your head. Um, One is like numbers, and two is strings. Okay, so numbers, you might think, well, okay, a number is a number. Well, how many different kinds of numbers can there be, right? Well, depending on the programming language you're dealing with, it can get very specific between what you look at as an integer versus like a floating number, uh, or a very long floating number. Um, those are kind of distinct data types, and there's appropriate functions or syntax checking around that. So it could get pretty complicated, but I think within the scope of this course, just say they're numbers. Okay, so you have numbers as one data type, and then strings as another data type. Okay, again, even with strings, you can kind of get a little bit more into that, but for the scope of this class, let's just say numbers and strings. The last one may not be so apparent to people, And it's this idea of booleans. Booleans, as you can maybe kind of guess or figure out from this, is two states, right? It's true or false, right? Similar to how we were talking about like zeros and ones, presence and absence. Um, Booleans, where you have your two states, and generally they're evaluated true or false, okay? And there's ways that this is being used or leveraged within JavaScript, which I'll show you examples with as we go, okay? And so here we go. This is kind of like what I was mentioning before, where um, you can set multiple uh, multiple variables in one line, or declare. I'm being sloppy with my language here. Declare uh, multiple variables in one line, okay? Uh, and then you can assign it, right? Uh, it might be stating the obvious, right? But of course, you can't assign a variable before you've declared it, right? So you do have to declare the variable first, and then you have to assign the variable, okay? So in this case, we declared the variable tax rate, we created the bucket, and now we put something in the bucket, 0.088, okay? So you set this equals to that, okay? Now, you see this part here? It says optionally you can declare and assign at the same time. So you declare and initialize at the same time. Same thing as saying this, right? Declare and assign at the same time. And here they've declared this variable balance due, and then they've initialized it to be 0 or assigned it to be 0. Okay. And in this case, they've done both, right? They've done the tax rate and the balance due, and they've initialized it like this, okay? I'm just gonna say my personal preference. My personal preference would be to do this, right? As I said before, just a few seconds ago. Declare the variable, initialize it, right? Not initialize it to 0.088. Well, okay, this one is a tax rate. So yeah, if you think your tax rate is gonna default to be 0.088, then go ahead. But definitely like balance due, that should be 0, right? Okay. So this is about variable declaration and assignment. Okay. So remember this right here, var. You can do multiple at the same time. You can assign it like this, standalone, or you can initialize it as you declare it, just like this. Again, my preference will be this. Okay. Okay, and so this is some comments about writing numbers. So something like this. Yeah, you're not going to write a percentage like this, right? If you're doing stuff in Excel or something like that, you might see something like that, but it gets kind of confusing, right? It's much more straightforward to kind of say, well, if I'm going to look at a percentage of 33%, it's actually 0.33 of something, right? Not everything is able to look at this and then automatically know that it's actually 0.33 when you do a calculation, right? So with JavaScript, you're doing calculation off of this. The best thing for you to do is to do 0.33. Okay, like I said, if you were doing something like this in Excel, you might be able to get away with saying 33%, and then Excel with no behind the scenes, that's actually 0.33, and then do its calculation, right? But I think it's better just to work with it as 0.33, right? So it leaves some of the confusion out of there. It's pretty straightforward, 0.33, okay? And then a similar token, right? When you look at this, right, it's 10.89, that's the number. The fact that it may be dollars, it doesn't necessarily have to be dollars, it could be some other currency, right? That comes later on, right? So that part the dollar sign can be represented later on. What you actually store with, what you actually work with on the computer would be 10.89. Okay, so that's the number you work with. And likewise, here, this is a number the computer sees, right? The computer looks at this more from a formatting perspective, right? You want to format it more for people to understand it, because I look at it, I have to count the zeros to figure out what's going on here. You look at this, you can see right away it's a million, right? Because you can see the commas here, okay? So this is more of a display thing. This is what the computer, quote unquote, the computer, of course you know that everything goes down to binary, right? But what JavaScript will be looking at to do its calculations, right? It's not going to look at a variable as this. If you put something like this in there, it's going to think of this as a string, okay? So again, similar type of thing here, okay? This is what the computer knows, okay? This is more for human benefit, okay, to look at it as a display thing, okay? So just understand that idea. All right, so for strings, you have basically characters. I keep on saying like a string of characters. That's really what I want to say, but it's a sequence of characters. Let's put it that way. So a string could be like ABC. It could be dog, cat, whatever, right? It's a sequence of characters that you put in there, and there could be a space in there too, right? This point here actually is good, right? So you have single quote or double quotes around the string. So you could say like variable animal equals to, and then you would have like either single quote or double quote, but you have to make sure they match, right? You can't do a single quote and then close it with a double quote. That's going to screw things up. But like a single quote and a single quote, and then in between you have like dog or cat or something like that. And same thing with the double quotes, okay? We're going to come back to this later because it can get a little bit confusing if you actually remember we were talking about escape characters for HTML. If all of a sudden you kind of have like, let's say, Jill's dress, right? So you have Jill, and then you have a single quote, and then you have S, right? And then dress, right? So there's a single quote there. Well, is it a single quote to declare a variable, or is it a single quote for Jill's dress, right? The computer doesn't know, JavaScript doesn't know. It's going to get confused, right? So I just introduced that idea that there's some things you have to be careful with when you work with this. We'll get to that a little bit later on, so I don't want to spend too much time on that now, but I just introduced that as a little bit of a challenge there. And well, and we kind of cover a little bit here, right? So here, look at this, right? Here's the apostrophe S here, right? So this is how to avoid, one way to avoid getting confused, right? It's the idea of the escape character, okay? And then declaring an empty string is this, right? So just like the two quotes next to each other, okay? And similar to numbers, you can initialize the strings at declaration, okay? And then here's arithmetic operators, right? Arithmetic operators, as you can imagine, you can do addition, you can do subtraction, you can do multiplication, you can do division, okay? You can, like visually as a person, you might look at a piece of paper, you can put like two things next to each other, like in a formula, like an algebra formula or something like that. And you would say, oh yeah, you're going to multiply these two things together. But for the computer, you can't do that. So you definitely have to put like that there, right? So then it knows that you're going to multiply A times B. You can't just put A, B next to each other. Like if you did that for a human person, you might say, oh yeah, A, B next to each other means you multiply it. But you can't do that here. This is the mod function. If you were trying to implement this for your remainders, for your binary conversion, or hex conversion, right, could be, you probably would use a mod function, right? So all that means is that whatever numbers you divide, whatever that remainder is, that's what you get when you do the mod, right? And probably all of you know the PEMDAS rule from your, let's say, elementary school, middle school, whatever, right? Probably, I guess it's probably middle school. So anyway, PEMDAS, right? So that's basically the sequence order of operations when you are doing all these mathematical functions, okay? And that is the intro for JavaScript. Right, so what did we cover for the intro for JavaScript? Let me scroll back up here. And remember, this is in your textbook too. So it should fill out everything. Where's the beginning here? Here we go. Oh no, actually, chapter 10, I went all the way up too far. Where is it? Here we go. Okay, so the names for variables we talked about. We talked about initialization and declaration. We talked about data types. We talked about assignments. We talked about operators. Okay. This part is something that we'll be picking up more in future lectures as we go more into JavaScript. This is the introduction side on the left-hand side here. We'll get into this, like I said, when we do the more quote-unquote advanced JavaScript. Okay, thank you.